Until then, we've been dead. Okay, welcome.
Mainly dead all day.
We've been mainly dead all day, yes. I'll leave it there instead of pursue that avenue. But welcome everyone who's joined us in person. And for those of you who join us later, we welcome you as well. As we start, let's begin by talking to God, and then we'll get underway. Father, thanks for this opportunity, yet another opportunity to get together as a group of people who are interested in the stuff you have given us to follow as part of our lives, the words you have left behind for us to integrate into our lives and to better shape our response not only to you, but to those around us. And so we'd ask for clear communication to take place, especially as the subject this evening is one that is so often misunderstood and in fact abused. And so may we not be part of that process, but be part of the clarification process. So good communication, but more importantly, that we be able to integrate these things into our lives so that we can better reflect you to those around us in the world in which we live. In Yeshua's name, amen. Okay.
Read the title, which I love.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I wasn't going to, but I will do that. And unfortunately, the person...
They have small children. So
yeah, they have small children, but they usually join us afterwards if they don't join us in real time. Okay. The way in which we like to do this is we try to deal with the questions that we get first, and then the questions we get later. If we don't do them tonight, we do them another time. And we did get several questions that have come in over the course of the last several days. So I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. And I apologize as well to those who sent in questions in previous weeks, but they came to us later than this question came to us. So the heading of this particular question was Caution, Cultural Hot Topic. And maybe that's the way we should have advertised this.
It should have.
Yeah. While answering the question during the last Stump the Stars, and since this is dated October 12th, that would have been back in September.
Last month.
Yeah. Anyhow, you brought up the ever popular topic of women in leadership, and I don't know how we managed to do that, but we did. How do you support your view of women in positions of authority? What is the evangelical church missing? And we will add in a few minutes, not just the evangelical church, but much of Messianic Judaism missing when it looks at Pauline passages such as, but not limited to, 1 Timothy 2:11-15 and Ephesians 5. And what can be done to shift to a more biblically accurate mindset? Well, that's sort of, for us, that's sort of a layup. And I can use those terms because the World Series is over, and I will not offend myself by using a basketball metaphor or analogy rather than a baseball one. But anyhow, and then it says, someone tired of egalitarianism and complementarianism. So now we've set the stage for this particular subject. As part of setting the stage, you were going to say a few things. So why don't you do that? We talked about it in the car just as we pulled up. Why don't we start with that?
Okay.
Yes, please. Ladies first.
Okay, I like it then.
Or, yeah, especially tonight.
I'm going to draw on it.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is a hot topic. It might not be a hot topic in churches that y'all might go to. I'm not Southern, but I do use the plural you, y'all. Because I think in many churches, this is not a hot topic like it was in the 70s. However, this evidently is a hot topic in Messianic Judaism, and Messianic Jews have a unique problem in this. In other words, I, as a woman, and also as a Messianic Jew, I find myself with two different sets of problems that sometimes get convoluted into one big, giant, unsolvable problem. We, as Messianic Jews, need to look at both Christian theology and Jewish theology. And on the topic of women, those who feel uncomfortable with a woman standing up and giving a sermon, for example, in a congregation, if they don't hit you with this is what Rav Shaul, which is what we call the Apostle Paul, if Rav Shaul, if they're going to hit you with several of those verses, if they don't, they'll come at you with but Orthodox Jews don't use women either. So we have to be able to sort out which problems come from which set of people. And that is a big problem, because when somebody is against what you're doing, they're going to throw every type of stuff at you. They're going to wad up every piece of paper they can find and throw them at you as they remember them and as they try to apply something that will prove you wrong. And there's two sets of variables that you can be proved wrong. Is that helpful?
Sure.
Also, when you swallowed these two words, but they're big, so later on we will mention these: egalitarianism and complementarianism. If you don't know what those two words are, that's okay. We'll explain them in a little bit.
Maybe.
I think they should know what
Okay.
those words are, because people fling those
Should
to
we
and
just do it
assume.
now?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay, basically, although these terms, like many other terms, have become, and I will coin a term, modified or muddied, egalitarianism became a fairly popular movement in evangelical circles. That was in the 70s, as I recall. This is the basic position that holds to the fact that the biblical teaching is such that women can have the same levels of leadership and function in the same positions as men. The other side fairly quickly sprang into being as a counter movement, and that's basically complementarianism. And they use the term complementarianism so as to make their position seem more complementary, because frequently it was pointed out that the non-egalitarian position basically puts women in submission to men. Well, you don't want your movement to reflect that in its title. So it became complementarianism. That's pardon me if that's a somewhat cynical assessment of how the terms came into being, but being around for that discussion.
So they both sound equally good.
Yes.
Supposedly. But they're just labels.
Yes.
As long as I only mention this because the very first person who spoke at our general meeting for the Messianic Jewish Union in the summer, the very first speaker who got up on this topic said the word complementarianism. And I'm going, and I bet 3 people in this audience know what he just said. And because once again, you just get so blinkered and you're just staring at your side of the argument.
Now, I'm going to go a little different direction than I thought I was going to when I was thinking about what I would say next. But it was triggered by something you said. So let me start out by saying, quite as firmly and as clearly as I can without being at all offensive, coming from a Jewish perspective, Orthodox Judaism is not the gold standard of what Judaism is supposed to be all about. And in case you did not hear me correctly, Orthodox Judaism is not the gold standard of what Judaism is to be all about. Now, I know many in the Orthodox world and in the non-Orthodox world don't hold to that. Okay, so I admit that right from the start.
It's not something the Messianic movement is striving for. This is not what our goal is, to be Orthodox Jews. That's not, we're not trying to, for most of us.
Yes.
If you're called to do that, yes. But as a movement, no, because there's pluses and minuses with Orthodox Judaism too.
So, but as a standard, Orthodox Judaism is not the standard, although, like I said, many people seem to gravitate that direction, at least functionally, if not conceptually. Just to give you a little bit of background, just so I'm completely transparent on this, I've been educated both in an evangelical seminary and I do have a degree in Judaic studies from what used to be called Spertus College of Judaica, now it's simply called Spertus Institute. That is a college of Jewish studies. So that's part of what I bring to the table in this particular discussion. I think if you understand the development of traditional Judaism, and I'm not going to call it rabbinic Judaism because for most people, rabbinic Judaism supposedly appears sometime in the late 2nd century or early 3rd century of the Common Era, with the codification and writing down of what's called the Talmud. The rabbis existed far earlier than that. And in fact, according to some sources, both Jewish and non-Jewish, what we would call the rabbinic traditions can be dated as far back as the time of the captivity. And some even say to pre-exilic periods. And I'm not talking about Orthodox Jews who are arguing that. I'm talking about non-Orthodox Jews and also non-Jews as well. So, hence, for me, rabbinic Judaism is something that goes back into the Second Temple period. It's not something that's post-Second Temple. That's part of a whole other discussion. But again, just to be completely transparent as to where my response is coming from. As you study development of what is traditional Judaism, you will see that it did, in fact, develop. It developed from Moses to Ezra. It developed from Ezra to the time of Yeshua. It developed from Yeshua to the time of the Talmud being codified and written down. It developed post-Talmudic as well. In other words, Judaism was always a developing and meant to be a developmental faith tradition and response to God.
Dear Jesus.
If you understand that as part of the framework and foundation for Judaism as it developed, both pre-Second Temple and Second Temple and post-Second Temple period, then you can understand why Orthodox Judaism would not necessarily be the gold standard. Judaism has developed through the ages. Okay, so that's part one of my discussion. Part two of my discussion is and this is just a quick overview of where Judaism has stood on this issue of the role of women. I'm not going to take you all the way back to Eve, although we could do that. I'm not going to do that, and I thank you for the response from several of you that I can see. I'm not going to take you back there, although there is some discussion that needs to be held there. No, I will take you back to Eve.
No, I thought we'd do that a little later when we go through Bible verses.
Oh, well, I was going to talk about Deborah and Huldah.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, but we will do that. All right. Many English translations have something like this when Eve is described. She will be a helpmate. You heard that?
Or a helpmeet.
Or a helpmeet. I've always sort of smiled at that and say, well, you know where we got it. It's because God said, Adam, meet your helper. The terms that are used there indicate, if I might paraphrase the Little Hebrew, suitable help of equal status. That's what the phrase means, suitable help of equal status. So that's Eve. So that's how we start. Now I'm going to hop along a little later in biblical history or in Jewish history. And the next person I want to pick up with is Deborah in the book of Judges. There was a dude early on in the book of Judges by the name of Barak. I'm not talking about our former president, but somebody picked a good name for him. Barak was an important general during the time period of the Judges. During the time period of the Judges, there came a time where the Israelis needed to respond to an incoming attack. And Barak was the functioning general in chief, so to speak, at that particular time period. But Barak said it very clearly that there was a judge at that time who needed to lead the people. He was not the leader, even though he was a general. The judge at that time was Deborah.
This is Judges 4, if you want to look later at this passage.
So Deborah was the leader at a very significant time in Israeli history. And in fact, she was a judge for 40 years. None of the judges judged for more than 40 years, but she was a judge for 40 years. So in other words, her administration was an important administration. Judge over all of Israel. Fair enough? All right, now we jump a few more centuries along the way. We're now in the time of Jeremiah. You know, like as in Jeremiah the prophet. Important dude.
Not the bullfrog.
Yeah. I'd forgotten about the bullfrog. Ribbit. Yeah, we'll set it aside. Okay. During the time of Jeremiah, I forget which of the kings it was at that particular time, there was a scroll that was uncovered during his reign. And they wanted to verify that this was in fact a Torah scroll. So they took that scroll and took it right to Jeremiah, right? That's what you would expect. But no. Some of you already know the story. I see you by your responses. The person who was going to authenticate the Torah scroll for the nation was a gal by the name of Huldah. Not Jeremiah, but Huldah was the authority for this. The authority in telling us what was Torah, what wasn't Torah. By the way, you now know her because of her gates, if you've ever been to Israel. In the wall around Jerusalem, not around all of Jerusalem, but at the Temple Mount, the second temple wall, you have the gates that the people would enter into, and they were the Huldah gates, or there was a Huldah gate there as part of the gates, in honor of her. Okay. That then brings me, let's see, where do we want to hop next? I don't have the time to develop this for you, but if you read the text of the Gospels carefully, you will find that among his disciples were women. And in fact, because of some of the status of the women, they were able to support his ministry financially. So they were not only disciples, but they were also part of the financial backbone and structure of the disciples. By the way, in a very interesting passage in the Gospels, you have Yeshua showing up at Miriam and Martha's home. And if you read that text carefully against the background of something, I think it comes from Pirkei Avot, but it goes back to Rabbi Yossi ben Yoetzer, who's about a century or so, maybe a little more than that, before Yeshua. And he describes how if you have the opportunity to entertain a rabbi, welcome him into your home. I'm paraphrasing him, but it's pretty close to what he says. And sit at the dust of his feet and drink in his words thirstily. Mary and Martha do exactly that. Yotzi was describing how the Talmudim, or the disciples or students of a rabbi, were supposed to act. Mary and Martha are being presented to us as exactly that.
And just one took the time to sit.
Yes, but the other was
That's a
doing.
whole nother.
Yeah, but the other was doing the other part of that, the welcoming. Then we move on. Where do I want? Yes, I want to move on next into the book of Acts. Rav Shaul's already on the scene. He encounters, I think it's in Corinth, but don't hold me to it. Maybe in Ephesus. He encounters some fellow tent makers who become part of the believing community surrounding the synagogue, in and surrounding the synagogue there. And their names, when they're first introduced, are introduced as Aquila and Priscilla. And they become co-teachers along with him. The book of Acts indicates he also references this. The rabbi does in 1 Corinthians. But with one exception, when the two are mentioned, Priscilla is always mentioned before Aquila. That indicates that in some sense she had prominence in the teaching. This was not like what I did earlier this evening, ladies before gentlemen, although that's not to set aside that practice. But anyhow, that's not what's going on. It indicates her role in the teaching. We wander on into the book of Romans, and there's a woman who's mentioned there by the name,
Junia, where is she?
oh, I'm not going to go to
Oh.
Jude first. I'm going to go to Phoebe first.
Oh, Phoebe.
Phoebe is mentioned as a deacon. A lot of English translations have it deaconess. No, she was a deacon, just like the other men, just like the men who were deacons. This was a second level of leadership in the early Messianic community. At the very end of the book of Acts, book of Romans, Rav Shaul mentions a co-worker of his by the name of Junia, and she, it's not a he, although many translations turn it into a he, she is called a fellow apostle.
This is Scott McKnight wrote a book called Junia is Not Alone. It's very short. I read it. It's excellent.
Okay,
It is excellent. It explains why the translators of this particular name, since they already assumed this person could not be a woman, they made it into a masculine name, but it is a feminine name in the Greek.
give them the title and the author
It's
again.
called, it's by, the man's name is, it's Dr. Scott McKnight, McKnight. Junia is Not Alone, and it is not long, and it is very rewarding to read.
Okay, and we will mention some other books along the way,
Yes.
by the way. All right, that gets us to Junia. There are a couple people who are mentioned in the book of Philippians, I think it's in chapter 4, who are also co-workers and therefore co-leaders with Rav Shaul. So that's what you have by way of the facts on the ground through the biblical text. Now, we're not done with Jewish history yet. There's an excellent book by a Catholic, I believe she was a nun, if not a sister or a nun.
Bernadette Bruton?
Bernadette Bruton, I believe Brown University. Bruton, Brooten. She did her doctoral work in this field.
Right.
Okay. Women leaders in ancient synagogues. Women leaders in ancient synagogues. And among the things she presents here in this particular discussion is the record of the rocks, if I might put it that way. What has been discovered archaeologically, not just in the literature of that time period, but in the actual stones of that time period in ancient synagogues. And she points out that you've got women who are called Rosh Knesset. Yeah, Wowie is right. Now, those who don't like that particular conclusion have said, oh, it's just an honorary title. Her husband was really that. No, the record in the rock says she was Rosh Knesset. Fair enough? 2nd century of the Common Era. There's a gal by the name of Bruria. If I remember right, wife of Rabbi Meir, an important 2nd century rabbi. The rabbis of her day listened carefully to her decisions. She was a decisor, which is an important position within Judaism.
And Rashi's 3 daughters were also interpreters of Torah too.
Yes. Was it 3 or 5?
3. 3 I know of.
Okay.
Forget about it.
Rashi now is the 11th century, but before we get there, Rashi reminded me, you have in the book of Acts, Philip. He had a bunch of daughters who, the text says, who prophesied, who acted as prophets. Now, just in case you misunderstand the biblical account historically, prophets are not predictors. They are preachers. They are preachers of the Torah. They do some predicting, but their role is to preach the Torah. So when the text says they prophesied, let's take it seriously. So that's Philip's daughters, and later we have Rashi's daughters. In between, we have Bruton and women leaders in ancient synagogues. Oh, by the way, women were counted as part of the minyan up until, and were also readers of the Torah in the synagogue up until going into the Middle Ages. By the way, speaking of that, as archaeologists have pointed out repeatedly, if you look at the layout of ancient synagogues, there was not a separate sitting section for women. They were not seated separately. But that's a whole other discussion, but that's part of the survey of Judaism. Now we get back to Rashi and then going thereafter. Now I'm going to take another big jump. Years ago when we were in Berlin, and we'll be back there again in a couple of weeks, We came to a historic synagogue in Berlin and saw that as part of it, this was a synagogue where the first woman rabbi in Reform Judaism served. This was from the 1930s. So women were rabbis in Reform Judaism since the 1930s. It took them a little while longer, but conservative Judaism finally got around to recognizing women leaders in the early 70s, 1970s. So since that time period, the two major branches of Judaism, Reform and Conservative Judaism, have had women rabbis. Other branches of Judaism have as well. Which brings us now down to Orthodox Judaism. In the last handful of years, in the last decade, so to speak, Orthodox Judaism has begun reconsidering this particular topic and has in fact ordained women to rabbinic positions, although they sometimes use a different title than rabbi. Do you remember one?
They're on here.
Yes, I thought
I read where it had the four different names that are in. Let me look for it. You continue talking.
Okay, one of them is Rabbah. But
Rabbinite,
yeah, there's another one. So anyhow, even Orthodox Judaism is in fact dealing with this issue. Unfortunately, much of Messianic Judaism is not. And in fact, much to my chagrin and my embarrassment, when the topic came up at this past summer's Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations conference and delegate meeting, the proposal that had been put together very carefully was modified, and so let me finish.
Yeah.
And by its modification, diluted what the proposal intended, which was for the union to begin to recognize just as fully the women who are rabbis among us. At least in the union, there are two women who are rabbis of Messianic synagogues. Okay,
that we know of.
That we know of, yeah.
All right. The name of the book, it's written by Daniel Sperber, and he's a pretty big author that you should know. Anyway, Rabbah, R-A-B-B-A, Maharat, which is M-A-H-A-R-A-T, Rabbinite, and at the end he has Rebbitzin. So ignore it, Rebbitzin. I'll tell you why in a minute. Women with leadership authority according to halakha. So he's building this women who have the right to tell people who are not female or not less than 12 years old what God wants them to do. This is controversial, but I'm going to put it out there because I don't want to forget. It has become popular among some in the Messianic movement to call the rabbi's wife Rebbitzin. This is a mistake. It's a big mistake. Rebbitzin nowadays, I'm not talking about when it first came up. Rebbitzin nowadays in the mainstream Jewish community is not
at least in parts of it.
Not a compliment.
Yeah.
Not a compliment. Basically, you're saying, if you say, yeah, the Rebbitzin is coming over, you're saying the BITCH is coming over. It's not a compliment. And I would say maybe your rabbi's wife, if she knew what it really meant, would not want to be called that. So every time someone calls me that, and it has happened, and they've tried to put it in print, I go, take that word out of my name. It doesn't mean what you think you want it to mean. Why don't you respect her instead of calling her something funny? Why don't you just respect her instead of giving her a title? Although I know lots of people like titles. He likes titles more than I do, but I just thought I'd warn you. Anyways, these other words that they're giving these ordained women are Rabbah, Maharat, and I've heard Rabbinite is one of the common ones.
Okay, so that's a brief, very, very brief survey of the Jewish position on women in leadership. There are other examples beyond the ones I've shared, and they're nagging in the back of my mind, but that's okay. We'll move on. Now, into this situation, I've already described how Yeshua functioned, in that he had women who were part of his discipleship group. Along comes this dude by the name of the Apostle Paul. So let's
That wasn't his original name.
No, I was going to say,
Once again, that title.
that's exactly where I was going. We call him Rav Shaul to remind ourselves that he was a rabbi. He was educated under one of the most prominent rabbis of his day. Gamliel, often known as Gamaliel. So he got a good rabbinic education. He talks about some of that. If you want to hear more about that, then you need to sign up sometime for the course that I teach called Epistles from a Jewish Perspective, but that's not our time here. Okay, so if he comes from within the stream of where Judaism is coming from, you would not expect him to hold a different position on women in leadership. And guess what? He doesn't. He is misread as holding that. And in fact, I've got a very good friend, and I will not share his name, who is very well educated, who is a committed leader in the Messianic Jewish movement, who, largely because of where Rav Shaul is supposed to stand on the issue of women, has in fact questioned whether or not those particular texts that were written are in fact scripture. That's how bad this whole situation has gotten. My response is this: he has been grossly misread and misunderstood, and if you read him in his context, then you get a better handle for what's going on. Something else popped into my mind, popped right back out. Oh, something more about Judaism. You know what we do on Shabbat evening at a family Shabbat dinner for people who are married? Well, the husband reads to the wife, or recites to the wife, at least part, if not all of, Proverbs, is it 30 or 31? Like 31. Which is often translated a virtuous woman.
A virtuous woman. Who can find one?
Yes. Bad translation.
Terrible.
It means woman of valor, or a heroic woman, or
mighty warrior of God, really is what it means.
So that too is part of the package that was part of Rav Shaul's growing up, part of his understanding, but it was also part of Judaism. Please remember what I already said about him, which we've laid the foundation for. He has a fellow worker whom he calls an apostle, Junia. He also has another fellow worker whom he describes as a deacon, Phoebe. He mentions a couple more in Philippians. And then he works very closely with Priscilla and Aquila. By the way, there are some people who make a very strong argument for the fact that Priscilla is the author of the book of Hebrews. I don't happen to think that's the case, but a case can be made. That tells you something more. All right. Now that brings us then to the thorny passages. Please remember, having set this by way of a background, Jewishly, biblically, and New Testamentally, we dare not read the other text out of this context. Is that clear? That in itself should cause some doubt as to the misinterpretation and misuse of these texts.
So rephrase that so that we should not do what?
We should not read these problem texts as contrary to this particular context that we set historically and culturally and scripturally.
So don't see one side as contradicting the other side.
In other words, you can't read these texts in such a way as to contradict or stand contrary to what I've spelled out.
The New Testament does not contradict the Old Testament, right?
Well, even more.
In general.
No, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And even more so, parts of the Newer Testament don't contradict other parts of the Newer Testament.
That's
because I shared with you some texts from the Newer Testament, as well as from the Older, as well as from the rabbinic materials. Fair enough?
Good job so far, dear.
Okay, jump in anywhere here if
I will.
where you want to add. Okay. I'm going to flip the two texts that were mentioned by the person who submitted the question. Ephesians chapter 5.
If you don't have it memorized, maybe you should look at it.
I happen to have this memorized.
I'm not talking to you.
No,
I'm
no,
talking to
no.
them.
But I'm going to read it to you directly as it is often, if not usually, translated. I'm in Ephesians chapter 5, and it is verse 22. And in fact, in this particular Bible, which is one of my favorites, it has this as a separate paragraph under a separate heading, and it says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." Okay? Settled. Wives should submit to their husbands.
All the problems are solved.
All the problems are solved, with one major problem. If you look this up in the Greek, the word submit is not found in the text.
Ah.
Yeah, that's a big isn't it? And guess where it is found? It is found in the previous verse. Now look, I'm teaching a course called Biblical Hermeneutics, and anyone in that course, Betty, will tell you right away that
It's not a pop quiz time.
I know we have this wonderful back and forth. You must read each text in its context. One verse earlier is certainly part of that context. And in the verse before, you ready? Submit to one another. Got it? Submit to one another. That means wives to husbands, husbands to wives. They are mentioned a little later. Fair enough? That's point one. Point two, the whole text really begins the setting for it begins in verse 15. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise. So if you want to live wisely, let's get this text correct. That sets the stage for verse 18, which says, don't get drunk on wine. Instead, be continually filled with the Spirit. And then it describes how a Spirit-filled life or walk is carried out. Talks about psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, making music in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks. Hey, you want to check if you're really living a Spirit-filled walk? Are you always giving thanks? That's not usually what we list as one of the characteristics, is it? That's what the rabbi lists. And then the last one is submit to one another. Now, this text on wives and husbands then elaborates on what submitting to one another means. Context again. This is the book of Ephesians. Ephesus is part of the Roman Empire, and this book may have been written to more than just the Ephesians. There's some good arguments that can be made along that line. Again, that's not part of our discussion for this evening. In that Roman Empire, what was the role of the wife as compared to the husband? Wives were in submission to their husbands. That's just the way the Roman Empire worked. Now, in Judaism, it was different, as I mentioned to you, but we're writing now to Ephesus, where this would have been the situation. However, it's interesting to note that even in this situation, there were some things by way of exception. I think it's Acts chapter 19. We're reminded that the major deity in Ephesus was Diana.
Yeah, right. I should sing the song. No, sing. No,
No, not, if you want to sing
not the
that,
Paul Anka song. It dates me.
at the end, you can do that if you want. Okay, so the point here, even if the word submit would have been here, and it's not, would have been totally redundant at that particular time period. But what it is it's a descriptor of how we submit one to another. The wives are to do it to their husbands as to the Lord. In other words, yes, someone was pointing their finger upward. Exactly. That's the attitude that you were supposed to have.
You're not the Lord, you mean?
No, not, hey, listen, you've heard the what's called one of the 10 commandments or the 10 words. Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. If I did that, that would be
Pretty scary.
pretty scary. One of the clear examples of how not to fulfill that particular instruction. Anyhow, so your response to your husband should not be one of resentment or antagonism because of what the Roman Empire has foisted on you, despite your talents and abilities,
Fear.
or even fear.
Or being bullied.
but you're supposed to act towards him as you would respond to him as you would respond to Yeshua, your Lord. Fair enough? Now, get that interesting next phrase, for the husband is the head of the wife. All right, that's simply a cultural reality for that time period. And that's all that's reflected. But again, he's now saying you do that in the light of how Yeshua lived and did it himself. Then, verse 25, husband, love your wives, just as the Messiah loved his congregation, his family. Now, that's really, really, really important because husbands didn't have to love their wives in those days. They were expected simply to rule their lives. So they're being told to love, number one, and to love in a self-sacrificial way, not lording it over their wives, but what?
Love them.
Looking for the text, ought to love their wives as their own bodies and as the Messiah did and does for his family, the congregation. That's how husbands are to act. Fair enough? That's what the text is saying, and that's what the text is not saying. And there's all kinds of interesting discussion on this terminology of head. It is not head as it is understood in our society, but it has all kinds of connotations in that society. And again, without going into detail, let me see. Oh, it must be in another one of his letters. Rav Shaul talks about, correct me if I'm wrong here. Yeshua's relationship to God.
Philippians 2.
Okay. Is that where it talks? Yeah, I understand that one. Where it talks about the Father being sort of the head of the Son. There's a text that is vaguely back there.
1 Corinthians 15.
Thank you.
That was helpful. Thank you.
It was another one of his letters. Now, based on that text, there are all kinds of conceptions and teachings concerning the Trinity. And again, this is just a quick aside, but this is to bring it in because it's relevant here as well. In which there's virtually a hierarchy, a functional hierarchy found in the Trinity. That's how it's taught.
Yeah, we're not saying that's true. We're saying that's what some people say.
Based on the 1 Corinthians 15 text and a misunderstanding of the Trinity. If you understand the Trinity, and if you want more discussion on this is another commercial. I will be discussing it from a Jewish perspective in the Messianic Apologetics course next semester. So be there or be square, as they say. Anyhow.
Nobody says that anymore.
Nobody says that anymore. Fine. Well, some of the people I'm looking at did smile back at me, so they understood it. Others are laughing at me for having used it. That's the younger generation. Okay, so a proper understanding of the Trinity or the triunity, whatever term you want to use, composite unity of God, we'll talk about all that next semester. They are on equal footing. And in fact, one of the two major statements of the Evangelical Theological Society you have to sign on the line for, if you're going to be part of that group, is just that equal status. If that's the case, that there's an equal status between Father and Son, and by the way, that fits perfectly culturally into the ancient Near East and how co-sovereignties took place at those times.
Co-regency.
That's what the term is, co-regencies. Thank you. Then when it says the husband's head of the wife, then it has embedded within it that same understanding of equality. Are you with me in the broader context? Good. Then I think we've managed to wander and waddle our way through this particular passage and the problems found within it. There is another problem found within it.
But, Yeah, so here's a problem that I've noted, and I had to point this out. The last time I had to point this out was to a woman. It's very nice to discuss husbands and wives. I got a blessing out of it. Didn't you get a blessing out of it? Okay.
Yeah.
But what happens if you're a single woman? Who's in charge of you? Who are you submitting to? And what are your options for, having other leadership roles in a congregation? Because if you're just talking about husbands and wives and you're just using them as your examples, then we're leaving out a whole pile of very capable people. Widows, divorcees, because they did have divorce during Yeshua's time. Please don't let anybody fool you on that. Divorce was divorce, and it happened, and we know, and we have records, we know about it. And it was not seen as a social sin. It was seen as an arrangement whereby everyone can continue living. So we can't just speak to women in terms of husbands and wives. That will not apply to maybe a third of all women. What about college students who are, older than 21? A lot of them are nowadays, and widows, no matter what age they are. So who's their boss? If you go under the everybody has to submit or women have to submit, it's leaving out a whole pile of people, and we have to bring that discussion to bear on this topic too, and not just husbands and wives.
That popped something else into my mind from our earlier discussion. At the end, I'm going to say it now, so at the end, how we need to be careful how we deal with this subject because of where we are in history.
Correct.
In our society, to forget. And another thing popped in my mind. If you want more on this, if you want more of this kind of thing spelled out for you in greater detail, a good group that you tie into is the group that produces the Priscilla Papers, interestingly enough, called Christians for Biblical Equality. Christians for Biblical Equality, or CBE. Okay. Now, 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15 is it's somewhat similar passage to Ephesians 5. But the thing that struck me is, at least in this translation, the very first line of this passage, which talks about husband-wife relationships as well, talking about now the wives of those who are considered deacons, in the same way as you respect a deacon who's a man, their wives are to be women worthy of respect. Same kind of respect. Now, again, this passage is often read much the same way as Ephesians 5 is, but having done Ephesians 5, I'm not going to go through all 1 Timothy chapter 2. But notice that it begins right away with saying the same respect. Okay. That brings me to another text. And I think it's 2 Timothy. Women are not to usurp authority over men. It's right. It is 2 Timothy.
I believe so, yeah.
I think so. Women are not supposed to usurp authority over men. I suffer not a woman to teach, is how that text starts. The terminology that's used in that particular passage is what is called, you can grab one? No. A hapax legomena. That's a fancy way of saying it only occurs once in all of Scripture. And as you examine this particular passage and its structure, and who's the author of that particular book? Which book? I Suffer Not a Woman.
Oh, it's called Suffer Not a Woman.
Yeah. It goes into great detail just on that. Can I see it?
It's I know I had a problem too. It's somewhere in there.
Oh, there it is. It's written by a husband and wife team of theologians, the Krogers, Kroger. I Suffer Not a Woman, rethinking, it's in that text, in fact. 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15, in light of ancient evidence. I believe the geographic context for 1 and 2 Timothy was also Ephesus. Uh, I'd have to double check that. I did not review that before. But in that particular society, there was a group of a religious group that was prominent at that time and in that place, in which the women were viewed as those who were to rule over men, the exact reverse of what happens in the Roman Empire, and the reverse of what we often view these verses as saying. And what they did is apparently some from within this group became believers. And when they came into the congregation there, they simply followed the same pattern they'd been brought up in, and they came in and seized authority in the congregation as soon as they entered. It appears that 1 Timothy 2 is written in response to that situation, because remember, all these things are written to specific contexts. That too, by the way, has a long Jewish history to it. It has to do with what's called the responsa literature, where often a community will reach out to a rabbi when they have a question, when they don't know how something should be applied, or a new situation arises, and they say to the rabbi, "Rabbi, answer this question for us. Give us a responsum." What is responsa? These letters from the rabbi are part of the messianic responsa literature of that time period. You see this very clearly in 1 Corinthians. You see it when he's writing to Timothy and Titus as well, just to mention a couple clear ones. Women are not to seize authority. Not that they shouldn't have authority. They are not to seize authority. Yeah, another more on that, see the Krogers. And I will mention our good friend Philip Payne a little later. Okay, so that's another part of the whole discussion. Now, that brings me to the last of the text that we wanted to talk about tonight in any detail, and that is 1 Corinthians 14, toward the end, somewhere around the 40s. Okay. And given that I was going to talk about 1 Corinthians 14, why couldn't I think of 1 Corinthians 15? But thank you, Jonathan, for reminding me of the 1 Corinthians 15 passage. Okay.
Yeah, here's 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34.
Read it, please.
Women, I'll read the context. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. As in all the congregations of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, must be in submission, as the law says. Verse 35, if they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church.
Okay, there it is.
Well, that's it.
That's pretty clear, right?
Yep, pretty clear.
Let me.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I want to quickly double check something a little later in that passage. You'd have to double check this in one of the books that one of the other scholars that has written on this subject does. As I recall, part of that text that she read is actually missing in some of the ancient manuscripts. But for more on that, you need to get a hold of Gordon Fee, and I believe his commentary on 1 Corinthians deals with this. All right, now, you heard what was just read, right? 3 chapters earlier, the rabbi says this: when a woman prophesies in the congregation, she's to do so. Most translations have it with her head covered. That whole discussion is also a discussion that we don't have time to get into. The structure of the text there indicates it could be the way in which a hair is styled, or something that you actually have on your head or on your hair. And it has to do with the message that's being communicated in that society, namely Corinth, because of your hairstyling. Not going to get into that. But he says, when you're sending the proper message culturally, then by all means, women are to do what? They are to prophesy. In other words, they're to take the role of a prophet. Remember, Philip's daughters took the role of prophet.
But they're told that they have to be silent in the same letter.
Okay, now, with him having said that in 1 Corinthians 11, and Patrice loves to hop on this one. You want to finish?
What?
Just thought you just started?
Yeah. So how can you have in the same letter, women can never speak, and when women speak, they should have their head covered? Why would you just pick one of those? We have to have both of those? And they must be able to be somehow made into both truthful. Otherwise, Rav Shaul's a nut bar. And some of us would say that every now and then, but not in this particular case.
Either that, or he is so old he has forgotten what he wrote 3 chapters earlier. Fair enough. Let's not forget what he wrote 3 chapters earlier when we misuse 1 Corinthians 14.
So then how do we say?
In a minute.
Okay, you got it.
All right, so this is how they are to speak. Please understand that according to Ephesians chapter 4, the number, and I think it's also in 1 Corinthians 12 or 14, when talking about spiritual gifts, the number 2 spiritual gifting after apostles is prophets. So this is at the top of the food chain, the top of the rung. And we already know that we had at least one example of a woman apostle. Should this surprise us? No, because as the rabbi says in 1 Corinthians 12 at the beginning, it's the Spirit of God who distributes the gifts as he chooses to distribute them. And it doesn't say whether it's to male or female. Fair enough?
Right.
All right. So here he says how the women prophets are supposed to function. So what's going on in 1 Corinthians 14? Read the context. Apparently there were some things going on where a woman happened to have a question about what was just said. And so she would ask her husband. That doesn't exclude the fact that the husband may have been doing the same thing with his wife. But he just raises one question here. He says, don't do that while the main flow of whatever's going on in that particular synagogue or congregation is going on. Don't interrupt what's going on by tapping the person next to you on the shoulder or elbowing them, whether that be husband, wife, or somebody else, and saying, what did they say? What did they say? This happens to me, used to happen to me far more frequently in my classes. There's nothing more disruptive than the person who bounces the elbow off their friend and say, what did they say? What did they say? If you got a question in class, raise your hand. I'll answer it. In this particular case, worship is going on. If you have a question and you need to have a discussion over that question, have that discussion afterwards. Fair enough? All right. He takes a deep breath. Because I think basically we've covered most of the primary.
Rav Shaul's
Yeah,
major problems.
the major problems, yes. We're going to mention some books for you in just a moment. But I think the main thing is you need to keep the passages in their larger context, both of what Judaism taught, what the texts of Scripture teach, and what the people who are writing have taught elsewhere, even as close as 3 chapters before the text you're now reading. Fair enough?
It's also, as I'm reading these again, these verses in 1 Corinthians, he is really keying in on husbands and wives. But once again, in real life, just because he didn't write about it in his life, there's women out there that don't have a husband. And it's not a knock against them. They just don't for whatever reason. So how are you possibly going to say that all these things having to do with husbands and wives have to apply to them too, just in case they're married or something? I don't understand it. And unfortunately, these people get on a roll and you can't even interrupt them with your individual questions because they're so convinced that they have the only correct way to understand God. And let me just say this too. The Holy Spirit gives the gifts as he decides. Your spiritual gifts, and everybody, I understand, everybody has one at least. At least that's what I was taught. And I believe that we have capabilities, even if we downplay them, we still have capabilities. If you have been gifted with a public gift as a woman, what are you supposed to do? Did God make a mistake? Are you mishearing God? John and I talked about this the other day. We have two women rabbis right now, and in the past there have been other women rabbis, mainly who left
In the union.
in the union. And basically, they knew they were not accepted. It was open that they were not accepted. The male leaders who did not accept them wouldn't even look them in the eye and have a discussion with them. They were just shunned and rejected. To me, that's evil and wrong. So John and I were saying, so what would these guys who they firmly believe that women cannot be rabbis? So they have to sit together in meetings. So the woman sitting next to you, you can't, what are you going to say about her? God didn't give you that gift? Would you be brave enough to say it's impossible for God to give women these public gifts because they're not permitted to use them? Is that what you'd say to them and look them in the eye? I would like to know exactly how you think you're going to treat them as a brother and sister in the Lord, but you reject their calling. I don't get it. I mean, we're all fearful at sometimes. Sometimes there's times I'm fearful. There's times he's fearful. There's times we're all fearful. But how on earth do you sit next to somebody and you really, in your heart of hearts, think that their calling is not of God? So it must be of who? See, this is the problem. When it's not discussed, then these things fester. They fester. And when, just sociologically speaking, when the vast majority of people around are male, and you're one of the few females even sitting there, imagine the pressure. It would be difficult for even a mighty woman of God to put up with that. And that is something I think we need to deal with. And not that you have to run up to, the leader of your church or run up to your denominational leader and start yelling at them. But every now and then we should start discussions. I think discussions are helpful. Private discussions are the most helpful, but I think discussions in general about the topic, when it's not so personally laden with fear and anguish, would be helpful. And so far, the union has been able to just duck out of those conversations, and it doesn't do well for them because of that.
And the union actually is ahead of the game with respect to some others of the Messianic Jewish organizations. There is one Messianic Jewish organization that has taken this very seriously. It's not a large one at all. It's the Messianic Jewish Rabbinic Council. So,
but I will say this even about that group, and I know I'm being picky, but they have held the idea of women in leadership for, I think, more than a decade. It's been public.
Actually, two.
But they have been afraid to bring it up in public. They'll talk about it in their own meetings, but they won't share any ideas about this to anybody else. Probably because they're afraid they're going to be dumped on, because they've gotten dumped on about other topics before, but they have not spoken up when the time came to speak up. And
let's leave it at that.
I was just going to say, and for women, it's made it more difficult, is all I wanted to say.
All right. I think next we'll do what we promised. Or no, why don't you go ahead and address the modern issue before we talk about books?
Which one?
How we as followers of Yeshua really need to deal with this issue because of
what?
Younger generations.
All right. So when we said caution, cultural hot topic here, as the introduction to this question, original question. I don't know if you've been noticing, but I myself would be classified as a baby boomer, even though I'm one of the youngest baby boomers possible. He's an older baby boomer, and I'm a much younger baby boomer. So I almost hesitate to call myself that because, they make fun of us because we're old now, and that's okay. So we were alive during the 1960s and everything. Like, we knew what was going on. We were not just toddlers. We actually knew what was going on in the 1960s. I graduated from high school in 1968. So I think then I probably knew pretty much what was going on in the 1960s. Since then, attitudes have changed. Since the 60s, attitudes about a lot of things have changed. A lot of things. And nowadays, John and I have a granddaughter who's in high school. I know we don't seem old enough, but unfortunately, she is in high school. Of course, when she was about 10 years old, she was already acting like a 21-year-old in her mind. So, we should have gotten used to this. The high school generation right now, I don't care what you want to call them, they look at these things, the girls look at these things. They don't see any women speaking to them. They don't see any women up on the platform. They don't see women reading the Bible to them publicly. All they see, maybe there's a woman playing an instrument like the organ or the piano. And maybe in Shabbat school or, in Sunday school, you would have a woman teacher. But they don't see anybody, woman, in front of them being in leadership. Oh, the kitchen. You can be a leader in the kitchen. In fact, only women I think, are allowed to be leaders in the kitchen. I don't know what's up with that. When these young people, and I'm going to classify the 20-year-olds too, not just the high schoolers, but the 20-year-olds, they look at who's up front and who is leading, and they don't see any women. Except for, song leader. Some congregations have song leaders, and sometimes they allow a woman to get up on the platform and wave her hands. But when they look at leadership and they do not see someone who looks like them, what is there to hold them there? What can you tell them they have to look forward to in the future? Not that far in the future, maybe only 10 years in the future, and there's still no place for them. They don't know if they're going to get married, so they can't look forward to, when I get married, then I'll talk to my husband about this problem. What we show our young people is so important. It's more than what we say. Remember, talk is cheap. Your actions speak louder than words. When we're not showing our girls leadership that they could aspire to, then we're leaving them in the dust. And there's no place for them to go. This has happened to a whole 10 or 15 years of women in the Messianic movement, in the union. Because they reached, after they graduated from college, and were not part of the college and the teens, there was no leadership that they were allowed to be in. Even if they sort of thought they wanted to be, maybe they didn't want to fight that hard to be a leader. Our daughter went through this and is still going through it. We know many of the leaders who are our age, in other words, boomers, have daughters. They don't come to conferences. They're not involved with the union. We're happy if ours comes to congregation. But that was a problem, and it still is a problem. And the longer we wait on solving this problem as a group, the more prevalent the problem becomes. Does that make sense to everybody? So it is a matter of, we must demonstrate the leadership that we want to see being developed. And I would think that that's a no-brainer, man or woman. We must be able to see good leaders who are showing us how it should be done, and not just talk, and then not follow through. Is that what you wanted me to say? Is that what you wanted me to say?
As Patrice has pointed out on repeated occasions, optics are important.
Oh my gosh. Oh, and at this point, for the past, I'm going to say 40 years, for the past 40 years, when you go to university, let's skip high school. You've been to high school. You go to the big university. I don't care if it's what kind of brand of university it is, private, public, who cares? There are women professors. There are women heads of departments who are also professors. They just are. You don't go in and saying, I'm not listening to a woman. She can't have authority over me. Although I think there might be some people who, I don't know, they were homeschooled and they have a strange church. And so, but I've never heard of such a thing. It's totally accepted now. It's not a thing anymore. So I don't understand, once again, how men who are operating at the heads of congregation level cannot understand that a woman could be in charge of professors who, that's basically the top of your field academically. But they might say, oh, well, they can do that in the world, but not in the congregation. So how can we sort of bridge that gap and say, well, it has to be totally different in the congregation than we have, in a secular organization? Hello? I'm asking you.
Oh, I thought that was a rhetorical question.
No, because I can't answer. Can you answer?
No, I can't answer it.
Anybody have any answers to that? Why is it not okay to pull well, we just can't have it in the congregation, but they can have it outside in the world?
Wrong.
That's a bad answer, isn't it? You have to divide yourself. You have to be somewhat schizophrenic then as a woman. Here I can do this and there I can't. Just put up with that. It's okay with us. Anymore, it's not okay, is it? It's not okay. And shock of shocks, something I'm always showing John. So even at Christian colleges, I mean, not just average, but really, really fighting fundamentalist Christian colleges, they are now having women professors. What?
Oh.
Yeah, very, very strict and inerrancy holding seminaries. They're having women professors of systematic theology, women professors of church history, women professors of all these subjects that seminary dudes usually, and the women there have to study from. And that evidently is okay now. But see, it's just these old-timey guys who didn't get the message that the rest of the religious world is now becoming a way more, accepting of all these kinds of things, accepting of a woman's gifting. I don't know how they come up with then, well, I guess we can't use the argument that they're not a spiritual organization. So I'm not sure exactly what the argument would be, but it would have to be pretty sparse.
And what Patrice has mentioned relates to a very important, a broader principle, and that is unless we handle this task correctly, we are in great danger of making ourselves irrelevant to the world around us. Our role, our task from Yeshua is to present him carefully and accurately in the world in such a way that the reputation of God is enhanced. In our traditional terminology, Kadush Hashem, that the name of God, the reputation of God is enhanced in the world. This diminishes his reputation in the world. Now, lest someone then respond by saying, and I'm not saying any of you would, well, you're just coming from a relativistic perspective, and we're coming from an objective perspective, and you're just compromising so as to be better accepted in the world. Please remember the whole bulk of what we shared with you this evening, and that is the Jewish context of the biblical texts are very clear on the equality of men and women from the very first in the garden right on through to these responsa from the rabbi, Rav Shaul, to those that he addressed. The message is clear. As part of that, we want to share with you, before we throw it open to any questions, some of the books that we might recommend. I'm going to start it, then I'm going to turn it over to Patrice. I'm going to start it with someone that I went to school with. His name is Philip Payne, Payne. Just to give you some background, his father was a major professor and author in the area of the Older Testament. And I'm trying to remember what his major text was, something like Old Testament prophecy.
J. Barton Payne.
J. Barton Payne. So this is where this friend of mine comes from. He did a lot of work himself. He's got his doctorate. If I remember right, he got his doctorate in biblical studies at Cambridge University, not in Massachusetts, but in England. And that's a major Cambridge, if you know anything about the theological world. His book, and I want to make sure I get it in the right order. I see it.
It's only this thick, really.
His book is called Man and Woman, One in Christ. Now, I may have typed that up incorrectly, maybe One in Christ, Man and Woman. And then the subtitle is An Exegetical and Theological Study of Paul's Letters. All right? He's just dealing with Paul's letters. When I talked to Phil about this book when it first came out about 15 years ago, he happened to mention, well, it's the condensation of all the work that I've been doing through the years. His condensation, just on Paul's letters, is over 500 pages long. That's his condensation of his work on Paul's letters. So highly recommended, but be aware of the fact that it is 500 pages long. He gets into all these texts.
It's a textbook, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All
right. I'm going to mention the very first book I ever read on any of these ideas, which was back, I'm going to say, Eve was a toddler, and I might have been pregnant with Seth. So I'm going to say this was back in barely 1980. And this woman, I don't even know how I heard about this book. Her name was Patricia Gundry. It still is, as far as I know. She's still with us. She could have gone to her reward. But this book I read, it sort of had a funky name, but it's really a great name. It's a book called Woman Be Free. And I believe that's a quote from Yeshua, where he says, woman, go and be free. A call for responsible evaluation of women in church leadership. It's not a thick book. She's not a theologian at all. She is a well-intentioned lay woman. And she wrote this, a short book, a small book, it's like the flip side of Phil Payne is Patricia Gundry, but incredibly readable and incredibly understandable for even the least, a person who really doesn't understand reading easily, especially if they haven't been theologically trained. So she just puts it out there in very plain and regular English. The interesting thing about this book is, so she wrote this in the mid to late 70s. Her husband at that time was the head of Moody Press in Chicago. The people at Moody Press got a hold of this book. They asked her husband if he believed in the things that she was writing. And he said, yes, I support my wife. I think these are important things to know. And they fired him.
I believe it.
They fired him because of what his wife wrote and published under a very good publisher. Maybe they're mad because she didn't publish under everybody. No, I'm just kidding. But here's what I remember about this. She went through there's about, I'm going to say between 15 and 20 key verses that people interpret wrongly. People tend to interpret them as the comeuppance of these verses is, therefore, women can't do this. And she just went through each of these verses that she made a list of, and she put down like 2 or 3 paragraphs of each one. But it was what was in those 2 or 3 paragraphs that just, it was like you bashed me in the head with this book. I went, how come I've never heard this before? How come nobody says these things that she's saying? I understood her. She's not a theologian, and maybe that's why they took her for granted, but she's spot on. I'll give you an example. Everybody remembers in Genesis, 1 through 3, the whole thing with God is very, very upset with the status quo in the Garden of Eden. You remember God condemns the snake first, the serpent, he condemns him. Then God gets to the woman. And God says to the woman, in pain, you are going to give forth the fruit of your womb, or worse of that. You're going to have children, but it will be painful for you. Everybody's nodding. Here's the thing. Until the early 1900s, people, not only theologians, but actual people, including doctors, they said women should have pain in childbirth because God said they should. And therefore, we're not going to give this woman any painkillers because God said she just has to expect pain when she delivers children. This was going on until the 1900s. No painkillers for a woman in labor. Not because it might affect the baby. No, because it was prophesied that she would need to experience pain to have children. That was her part of the curse. Funny, I'm not sure that men still experience their part of the curse. And I know this is not a human characteristic because I know, based on observation as a child, that when animals give birth, they have pain too. So this is not just women have to have pain. I guess all animals have to have pain, and we shouldn't help them either because they deserve it, or it has to be that way. That was just one of the things she said to me, and I went like, oh no, they're using these viewpoints as like clubs. This is not just a viewpoint. This now becomes bang. In case you forgot, you're cursed. Bang. Really? I don't see a lot of that discussion going on nowadays or with men. But women, you know who you are, so you have to pay the punishment. So,
Any other books you want to point out?
oh, sorry. Am I taking too long?
Well,
But yeah, I know. But I'm saying she's great. And the other book that I read that I really appreciated from her is, yes, her book about marriage. It's called Heirs Together, the HEIRS, not heir, but heirs together, applying the principle of mutual submission to your marriage. So the idea of marriage is about submitting to each other. Once again, keep saying it over and over, and maybe people will pick up on it. I'm not sure. And let me see what else here is ringing a bell with her. I love the book called Junia is Not Alone by, what's his name, Scott McKnight. There are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds now, since the 70s, of other books that have to do with how women should be being treated in congregations. One that I love from a Jewish point of view is called Integrating Women into Second Temple History. This is written by a Jewish theologian woman. Her name is Tal Ilan. Tal is her first name, and Ilan is her last name, Ilan. She is an expert in Second Temple Judaism, and she actually has gone into the text, the original historical texts, and read through, Yeah, but
You like,
there she is again. She also wrote Jewish Women in Greco-Roman Palestine. She is very strong on, just like Junia, her name was converted into a man's name because the idea was already there. It cannot possibly be a woman, so we're going to make it into, that's a mistake. So we're going to make it into a man's name. See how this goes. Once you have made up your mind that a biblical story is saying something, and then you feel free to change the words of the biblical text because they don't fit what everybody knows is the meaning of that. They did it with Jacob. They do it with in the translations with other people. They've already made up their mind. They've already been taught what this person is like or what the situation should say. And then they change. Oh, they made a mistake. We need to change it. And that occurs at the translation level, which is scary as crap, to put it technically. Would you say? It's scary. Also, he talked about hapax legomenon, which is a word in another language that just occurs once. And you were mentioning the Greek word just occurs once. If you have your mind all made up about what a story says, and you don't know how to translate this particular word because it's the only time it appears, what do you do as a translator? What are your options? What should you do? Here's what they do. They go back to previous translations and see how they translated it. No wonder nothing gets changed. No wonder there's no new ideas. Because when they don't know, let's go back to the way it was always translated. That must be right. Except when we find out it's not right.
That's right.
It's not correct. And these are the times when the translator should know better and should deal with the text the way that they can, not in what they've always been taught, but how it is really should be translated that makes sense. Does that make sense to you all? These are tripping points where people trip up, and then it affects generations of people because you learn the wrong thing and it's hard to get it out of your brain.
okay, one final book for now. And the editor is Alan Johnson.
Oh yeah, this is very good too. I read this.
How I Changed My Mind About Women in Leadership. It's each of the chapters is written by a different person, a major theologian and scholar who held one position on this issue and changed their mind. And that in each case, they tell you why they changed their mind, what led them to do that. So Ellen Johnson, How I Changed My Mind About Women in Leadership. It's not a very long book. So those are just some of them. As Patrice mentioned, there are bunches of others, but we share those with you. Now, given the nature of this topic, it's not surprising in the scope of it that we've run a little late, but we do, before we close things off, we did want to leave it open for any questions you might have on what we've talked about. Normally, during Stump the Stars, we just throw it open for just any questions you had on any topic, whether we covered it or not. But in this case, let's just limit it to this particular topic. So if you have a question,
It's a pretty broad topic.
yeah, it's a pretty broad topic. Stick your hand up and we'll recognize you. Okay, Georgiana.
Me?
Yeah, or Georgina, sorry.
That's fine. Thank
David,
you.
thank you.
So I have a question that is really vexing to me. And I'll just speak by the Old Testament, okay? Because this is what all Jews agree on, right? Hopefully. So if there's women in the scripture like Rahab, like Deborah, like the women of Thebes who actually killed somebody in a battle, a woman like Abigail, whose husband was a big disaster and she prevented the war, a woman like the wise woman of Abel, that somebody was going to, this is key, okay? somebody was going. This army of Israel came against this city, and they were going to destroy it. So this woman climbed up the wall and she said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, we came here to because so and so we need to kill him." So what did the woman do? She says, "Don't worry. Wait a minute." She climbs down. She talked to the people. She said, before she even talked to anybody else, she said, "We're gonna cut off his head and cut it and throw it over the wall." And this woman went down the wall. It's giving me goosebumps. She went into the city. She told the people. They cut off their head, hit the man's head, and they threw it over the wall. I mean, it doesn't say she was the leader or anything else. Just a little woman. Okay, Huldah, who's a prophetess. I could go on and on, but you get the idea. Okay, so if with all this proof in scripture, how is it that people never mention them, never think about them, never take their example? This is no coincidence that all these women are leaders. And in fact, obviously, this is a subject of great interest to me. There's even a scripture which you probably know about, where it says that, and not that I agree with it necessarily, where it says the woman is the crown of the husband. Okay? What's the crown? The crown is the item that gives the authority. You know, the Queen of England, she has the crown on, and you know, when she's going to rule. She doesn't walk around with the crown all the time. When she's going to rule. Okay? I said enough. I guess you get the point. Why?
Why what? Why?
Why have people missed it?
Why people just don't use it? Why don't they look at that? You know, they thumb the Bible. Oh, the Bible, the Bible. But there's so many examples that is no coincidence. You cannot miss how God sees women, how God uses women. You can't miss it. It's like just cutting off your jaw because of something. You know. I don't know.
I'll give $50 to any of you who's heard a man give a sermon on Deborah. It
Thank
doesn't
you.
happen.
I missed her. Thank you.
It
Okay?
does not happen. Why is that? Do you really want me to say why?
Yeah.
Because men are intimidated by it.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I love all the men in my life. I think very highly of all the men in my life. But I think in general, men are intimidated, at least they have been in the past, by strong women. And they don't want to fight against them. I mean, we could say that about a lot of problems in our society. Why doesn't this get solved? Because somebody's intimidated. The people in power are intimidated. Right now, the men are in power in our situation, and they're intimidated. I have never heard of a man giving a sermon on Deborah. There shouldn't be a reason why they couldn't give a sermon on Deborah.
That's right.
Ruth,
And by the way,
they do give sermons on Ruth, but she more knows her place. So.
Yeah, no, and I don't believe in women bossing it over men. I just believe, like you folks said, each
Now,
other.
I will add another thing, and that is if you've been taught a certain way, it's tough to think a different way. And if
Yes.
you've been taught it down,
And that's true.
yeah, so that's part of it. Now, there are two questions outstanding, but there's one that I saw on the chat, and it's an important question. And it relates to the statement, if I remember right, is in Galatians chapter 3. There is neither male nor female, a slave nor free, Jew nor Greek.
Yes, did I?
I
Okay.
agree with that.
All right. That has been used by some in the what we call the egalitarian movement to argue against the Jewish distinctive. But what it misses is the text talks about a status of equality. It does not eliminate distinctions. Because in Ralph Shaul's world, and he's the one who wrote it, he distinguished between slaves and free. And in fact, in one particular case, in Philemon, he said that Onesimus, the slave, should be freed by Philemon.
Yes.
But in other places, he says that slaves should act a certain way, and those who are their masters should act a certain way. The distinctions remain. When he said neither male nor female, he did not say that those distinctions were abolished. There were still men and there were still women that he acknowledged as men and as women.
Right.
And as husbands and wives. The same thing with then Jews and Greeks or Jews and Gentiles. They're on equal footing, but there are distinctions.
Right.
And all are redeemed in the same way.
Yeah.
In the exact same way. It's just that we're not totally alike. But whatever God has created, he's redeemed.
Okay, now, Bethany, you had the hand up on your screen, but you put it down.
Oh,
If you're talking, you're muted. Okay.
All right. Sorry, it's loud over here, so I apologize. You mentioned the role of prophet. How would you say that that differs at all from the role of elder? Because I've heard people say, well, yes, women can be prophets, but they can't be elder pastors because they're different. But the way you described them sounded similar.
The function is similar, and that gets back to if a woman can be an apostle or a deacon, then they can clearly be an elder. Because an apostle was over the elders of the various congregations. And some of the giftings involve not just pastor, but in the Ephesians text, it's pastor-teacher. What would a pastor-teacher be but an elder of that particular congregation? And it's a spirit who doles out those gifts. So if the spirit doles them out to a woman, then the woman is the recipient of said gift and cannot function that way.
some of these questions are because in general, people, when you say the word elder, well, that could be different to each of the people you're talking to, depending on what their childhood was like and depending on what kind of church or synagogue they grew up in. So I'm going to use rabbi. Is it possible to be ordained as a rabbi and you never give a sermon? Yes, it's possible. Well, what kind of rabbi would you be if you were ordained as a rabbi and trained as a rabbi? Why would you become a rabbi? To become a reading or a scholar, they can also be rabbis. So when you say elder, or if you're talking about the leadership council of the congregation, leadership council of the congregation, not all of them stand up and give sermons. They just don't. And it's also permissible to allow people to give sermons who are not elders. In fact, when they have guests, they do it all the time. It has gotten so bad that when we were, once again, and this is in the 1970s, we were at a Christian camp in upstate New York with his family. Not my favorite place, but anyway, it was fine. It was fine. The family was all together, and every evening they would have a speaker. Very, very nice. And they were all men. Okay, that's fine too. One time, a very famous speaker was supposed to come. He got sick and couldn't come. He sent his wife. And she was, yeah, go ahead.
His wife, who is a better speaker than he is, and he's an amazing
We
speaker.
women knew she was a better speaker than the men, but the men had never heard her. And here's what they told her. You can come and speak instead of your husband. That's very nice. Isn't that nice? We're going to allow you to do that, but only if you give your testimony. That's the only thing you can speak of. Well, she's no dummy. She went to Cambridge. And so, yeah, she gave her testimony and we got a lot of theology in there because she's a smart cookie. But yes, it was in the context of her coming to the Lord. So once again, I'm never trying to trick anybody, but I find it interesting that these many people have, when you say leadership council, they have an idea in their mind, and then they never think through the ramifications of, so what does that actually mean that they're in charge of? What are they allowed to do? What don't they do? And that may be just at your little group, and no other places that have a leadership group have these thoughts at all. They do it entirely differently. These are why you have to have discussions about these things. Our congregation, we're 40 years old, have had women on the leadership council every single day of that 40 years. And I've started to say this to other people because other people in the Messianic movement, they go like this: what? You have what? You have women? What? Oh, our rabbi won't let us. What do you mean? He won't, what? What? So it's crazy. But I'd share knowledge if I was you. I'd share what some congregations have. And you might learn, oh, I didn't know that you could even do it that way. Well, yeah, there's not just one way to do it.
Okay, back to the text. Because you brought up pastors. Ephesians 4:11. It was he who gave some to be, catch the order, as I've mentioned before, apostles, prophets, evangelists, some to be pastor teachers. If you take that as it's given, then if you can be an apostle or a prophet, which are listed above the pastor teacher, then you would think it's also okay to be the pastor or teacher or elder. Does that make sense?
Of course.
And I will say this, here's what I know very well is the Presbyterian understanding of eldership. And they do have elders and they're called elders, and they have deacons, which are a different group of people. If you're more from a Baptistic point of view, then your Baptist deacons are the elders, I guess. But anyway, back to Presbyterians. So my dad was the head of the elders at our particular church. And he came home said very clearly to all of us, we were having a discussion about how different churches do it different ways. And he said, in the Presbyterian church, the minister, as they were called, the minister is the teaching elder. The rest of the elders do other things. But he's there as the teaching elder. So he says, in fact, my job he's called the clerk of the session. It's all these vocabulary words. The clerk of the session, the head of the elders in a Presbyterian church, is actually the boss of the minister. Once again, your way and the way you are familiar with doing things may not be the way anybody else is doing it. And I think it's interesting to find out these different perceptions of what happens. In a Baptist situation, it seems like the pastor chooses all the people on the elder board or the deacon board, and then he tells them all what to do. And he gets them out of, if he doesn't like them, he kicks them out of the deacon board, and if he likes them, he'll bring somebody in. And every now and then they have a vote, but not very much.
No.
I don't know how it works. That's been my impression.
Okay. I see only one question left, and that's Virginia. So is it a question, Virginia?
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Okay,
Sorry
good.
it took so long. Okay, I have two things. I first want to share how one time when you all went on a trip home to your parents, I think it was, and we had an entire couple of weeks where it was all women who performed the Shabbat services, our Erev services. And the first couple times it happened, I didn't think about it. I was just worshiping. And then it dawned on me, wait a minute, there wasn't a single man up there. Wow.
And you survived.
Well, no, that wasn't a problem because I went to a Catholic boarding school and
I'm just teasing. Go ahead.
but it was just the perspective was different, yet everything was there and it was beautiful. And really as a whole, I noticed the difference, but I didn't per se because it was an equal, because there was nothing different, but there was a woman perspective and a woman voice, and it touched. But my question now on the subject is, as we see today in the outside world, what's going on corporeally around the whole world, is this possibly a way, the fact that when they go to do the research, they don't go far as back as to look at the actual text. Could this be something that the Hasatan has done to prevent forward movement of the women?
I am always very careful about what I assign to Satan Hasatan. No, I don't think that is. I think he takes advantage of situations as they develop, wherever they develop. Now, this is just something like we sort of addressed along the way in bits and pieces. This is the way in which, number one, some people simply have not done what you have said. They've not examined all the text and context carefully enough, either historically or exegetically, or they are, as Patrice has hinted at more than once tonight, they have been taught this so often, so frequently, so fiercely that they cannot see beyond it. And it's difficult. Before you can learn, sometimes you have to unlearn, and unlearning is a whole lot more difficult than learning.
I think part of what, I don't think it's Hasatan either, because I think human beings make up our own problems in a lot of cases. Human beings can be responsible for a lot of bad
Don't need a
stuff.
whole lot of help.
Don't need a whole lot of help. However, this is what I've noticed. I don't know where exactly in an individual that this takes hold, but there are certain people who strongly believe that there's a hierarchy in general. Let's use the example of, I'm just going to use the example of Great Britain. So in Great Britain, there's the idea of a hierarchy, and it's the royals, and then it's the dukes, and then it's the sort of rich people, and then it's everybody else. And they have kept those, it's really a stratified society still, even though, yeah, everybody's equal, except there, it's really pounded in your head that you cannot possibly aspire to be good enough as the queen because you're a totally different class of person. In America, we make a big thing of everybody's equal. Everybody's equal. Yes, except in your mind, and I don't think that serving in the military would assist you in this. It would make you more, there must be a person in charge, and then the person in charge assigns the second in charge, and then the second in charge assigns the third in charge. And if you're a private, you get no say about this whatsoever. So whether it's overtly taught or whether we give a nodding acquaintance with it, there is a very strong idea behind this. Somebody is in charge. So and they did write some areas in books from complementarian. So there has to be somebody in charge in the house. Well, who said? Well, everybody knows there has to be somebody in charge. Because if you don't have one person in charge, it will be chaos and confusion. So God says the man should be in charge. That doesn't really say anything like that. That's something that some people feel happy with because they feel comfortable with that situation. And others, I would say a lot of Americans feel the idea, you weren't born the queen, so you're just the same as me, and I might have just as good ideas as you. But you can't, in a military organization, you could not operate that way, obviously. And I don't think the family should be operated in a military way. Just call me crazy. It didn't work for the Von Trapp family in Sound of Music, did it? The whistle thing. Having the kids come when you blew the whistle. That, I'm joking, but you see how it's easy for some people to come into that and learn that from overt teaching or from the society we have. And I think even in the past 50 years, we've seen a lot more people saying, hey, I'm equal with you. Don't put me down and don't ignore me. Oh, the people in charge don't want to hear that. They just don't. So yeah, it is always going to be a struggle. It's always going to take time, but there are certain people whose minds are set in that hierarchical structure. And I don't think, especially when they get to be really older, you're never going to talk them out of it. Like I say in certain things, I started saying I'd say about 10 years ago when it dawned on me, there are certain people, when you reach our age probably, they're not going to learn anything new. And so they'll have to die out. So when our granddaughter is our age, she'll have her own very strange ideas that the young kids don't like. But I think over the course of my lifetime, I've seen things switch quite a bit. And I think for the better, for the worse. I think in general for the better, is humanly speaking.
Okay,
I just
Thank
want to
you
add
all.
one more thing. I want to
If
wish
it's quick.
everyone Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Happy.
And
Have a good week.
thank you all. Before we close in
Thank you.
prayer, I want to say thank you all for your patience, for your questions, for your interaction. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you. Now, I do want to say one more thing, and that is the next Stump the Stars is the second Saturday in December, and I don't have my calendar here with me. There will not be another one in November.
Sorry, we're going away.
Yeah, we will be teaching in Berlin at that time.
We're going to
so,
Berlin.
So what is the second Saturday in December?
Second Saturday in December is the 10th.
Okay, so we'll next see you on December the 10th. But no, you can
Lord willing.
you can join us in classes, or you can join us in services. We'll be happy to see you there.
You can't join me in my class. My
Yeah, yours
class
is
is done
done.
for the semester, but you can join him on Thursday nights.
Okay, would you close in prayer?
Yeah. Avinu Malchenu, our Father and our King, we thank you and praise you. You are a great God, and it is a privilege to serve you. We thank you for giving us your word. We thank you for the ability to study and read and learn about you and about the world you created, and also how we should act in the world. Father, give us wisdom, give us strength, give us courage, and help us to discover what it is each of us need to do in our corner of the world. Show us new ideas where we need new ideas. Show us how to reach out to others that need you and need things that we can provide for them. Help us to be willing to give your love to other people that we may not even know today. But we're looking forward to taking your love in your word to others as we walk along our way. Help us to keep in your footsteps. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Jessica, don't close it out. Did they disappear already? Oh, Merrill and Rob, it was good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Friends from all, do you want to read the last thing that Yannicka said? Not out loud, just so you see it in his chat.
Yeah.
Okay, then Shavua Tov.
Shabbat Shalom. See you in
Thank you
December.
so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for